There's a moment in every relationship that no one talks about, when nothing is said, yet everything begins to change. The warmth softens, the silence grows heavier, and a subtle distance starts to form, so quietly that you question whether it's real or just in your head. But what if it's not? What if your mind is detecting patterns your eyes haven't fully understood yet? In this video, you'll uncover the hidden psychological shifts that signal when a woman is emotionally pulling away, before it becomes obvious, before it's too late. You'll learn how to read the unspoken, decode behavior with precision, and protect your clarity, confidence, and self-respect in ways most men never do. Stay with me until the end, because once you see these patterns, you won't just understand relationships, you'll see them differently forever. There's a quiet phase in relationships that most people never learn to recognize. Not because it's rare, but because it doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't come with loud arguments or clear endings. It begins in silence, through shifts so subtle they slip past awareness. And yet, those small shifts are often the most honest signals you'll ever get. It usually starts with energy, not words, energy. The tone of conversations becomes slightly flatter. The pauses get longer. The enthusiasm that once felt effortless now feels measured. Nothing is obviously wrong, which is exactly why it's dangerous. Because the human brain is wired to normalize gradual change. You adapt in real time, adjusting your expectations without realizing something meaningful is fading. And the more emotionally invested you are, the more likely you are to rationalize it. But here's where it gets precise. Emotional energy is not infinite. In psychology, attention is treated as a limited cognitive resource. When it increases in one direction, it must decrease in another. So when you feel a subtle decline in emotional presence, it's not random, it's redistribution. That's why trying harder, more texts, more effort, more attention, often backfires. You're responding to a shift without understanding its source. Then something even more confusing appears. Irritation, not explosive anger, but a low-level friction. Small things begin to trigger disproportionate reactions. Jokes that once landed now fall flat. Habits that were once ignored suddenly become issues. And this is where many men miscalculate. They assume they've done something wrong and start adjusting themselves, trying to restore harmony. But beneath the surface, something more complex is happening. The human mind struggles with holding two conflicting emotional states at once. On one side, there's familiarity, history, and attachment. On the other, there may be curiosity, novelty, or a new source of validation. To reduce this internal tension, the brain begins a subtle process of reinterpretation, highlighting flaws in the existing relationship to justify the emotional shift. This isn't always conscious. In fact, it rarely is. But the result is clear. Perception changes before behavior fully follows. At this stage, communication starts to feel different. Not necessarily less frequent, but less open. Responses become shorter. Depth disappears. You may notice that when you ask simple questions, the answers feel incomplete. Not lies, just reduced access. And this is where the concept of emotional compartmentalization comes into play. Emotional compartmentalization is a well-documented psychological mechanism where individuals separate different emotional experiences to avoid internal conflict. It allows someone to maintain one relationship while simultaneously investing energy elsewhere, without fully confronting the contradiction. And when this mechanism activates, privacy increases. Not always in obvious ways, but in patterns. The phone becomes more guarded. Timing of responses changes. Conversations that were once spontaneous become controlled. Individually, these behaviors mean very little. Context always matters. But patterns are what reveal direction. Human behavior is rarely about isolated actions. It's about consistency over time. And your brain is constantly tracking that consistency, even when you're not consciously aware of it. That's why intuition often feels like discomfort without explanation. It's pattern recognition operating below the surface. As this continues, another shift becomes impossible to ignore. Priorities. Time allocation changes. Availability becomes inconsistent. Plans feel less certain. And perhaps the most telling detail, presence weakens. Someone can sit right next to you and still feel distant, because physical proximity does not equal emotional engagement. Now here's the part that most people misunderstand. This phase is not always driven by intentional harm. Human beings are complex. It's entirely possible for someone to still care about you while simultaneously drifting away. Emotional transitions are rarely clean or immediate. They overlap, they blur, and that's exactly why they're so difficult to detect early. Around this point, it's worth grounding everything in evidence rather than assumption. Research published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology has consistently shown that shifts in attention, emotional investment, and perceived partner value are among the earliest predictors of relational disengagement. Not dramatic conflict, but subtle cognitive and emotional reallocation. In other words, what feels small on the surface is often significant underneath. And once you understand this, something important changes in how you respond. You stop reacting impulsively. You stop chasing reassurance as a solution. Because reassurance treats the symptom, not the structure. Instead, you begin observing with clarity. You listen more carefully. You notice inconsistencies without immediately confronting or suppressing them. This is where emotional intelligence becomes your greatest asset, not in controlling someone else, but in regulating your own perception. Because the real risk is not that someone changes. Change is part of human nature. The real risk is ignoring clear patterns because you're emotionally attached to a previous version of reality. And that's where self-respect quietly enters the conversation. Not as ego, not as defensiveness, but as alignment. When you see behavior clearly, you don't need to force outcomes. You don't need to overcompensate or compete for attention. You respond proportionally. You communicate directly when needed, and most importantly, you remain grounded in what is actually happening, not what you hope is happening. There's also a deeper layer here that often goes unspoken. When someone begins to drift, they're not just moving away from a person, they're moving toward a feeling. Something that gives them a sense of novelty, validation, or emotional stimulation. The brain is naturally drawn to what feels rewarding. That doesn't justify behavior, but it explains direction. And understanding direction is far more useful than reacting to isolated actions. At this point, many men face a silent internal conflict. Do they trust what they feel, or do they continue to rationalize what they see? And this is where clarity becomes power. Because clarity doesn't force you into paranoia, it protects you from denial. It allows you to make decisions based on reality, not fear of losing the relationship. And here's the paradox. The more grounded and observant you become, the less reactive you feel. Because uncertainty creates anxiety, but understanding creates stability. Even when the truth is uncomfortable, it's still more manageable than confusion. As everything unfolds, the patterns either stabilize or intensify, and that outcome depends on variables that go beyond just one person. But your role remains consistent. Observe, understand, and respond with composure. Not urgency, not desperation, just precision. Because at the highest level, relationships are not maintained by effort alone. They are sustained by mutual attention, emotional presence, and alignment over time. When those elements shift, no amount of surface-level correction can fully compensate for a deeper imbalance. And once you truly understand these dynamics, something shifts inside you as well. You become less dependent on constant reassurance, less affected by ambiguity, more attuned to what is real, not just what is said. And that awareness changes the way you experience every relationship moving forward. In the end, this is not about catching someone doing something wrong. It's about seeing clearly enough that you no longer ignore what's right in front of you. Because the strongest position you can ever stand in is not control, and it's not assumption. It's quiet, steady, unmistakable clarity. Wait, don't scroll. Something deeper is happening inside her mind, and you're about to see it. Now on your screen, Psychology of a Woman Who is Slowly Disappearing into Her Own Mind. Like the video and subscribe,